This tape was produced and distributed by Happy Trudge Audio, Roanoke, Virginia. Thank you for your purchase, and we hope you enjoy your tape.
The following is a talk given by Cleve L of Waurika, Oklahoma, given at the 40th Virginia State Convention, held at the Roanoke Civic Center Auditorium, Roanoke, Virginia, on August 11th, 12th, and 13th.
Hi, my name's Cleve L, and I'm an alcoholic. By the grace of God and because of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I've attended an awful lot of meetings through the years, because of conventions like this, and because of people like you, I haven't had a drink today, and for this I'm very grateful. I am very happy to be here. I want to thank the committee for giving Nell and me the opportunity to be here and share with you. I'll thank Bud, Barry, and Tommy that met us at the airport, and Em, I want to thank you for that nice introduction. I'm from Waurika, Oklahoma. Now, some of you may not know where that is. That's 6 miles south of Addington and 5 miles north of Sugden. Waurika is county seat of Jefferson County, the largest cattle county in the state. And it was Indian territory until 1907. Some of the old timers that sit around down on the spit and whittle bench, talking about Waurika, say it's the hub of the plains where the pavement ends and the west begins, where men are men and women wouldn't have it any other way. Strange group of characters live there. 70% of the male population drive pickups with 30-30s in the gun rack. Man's home is his castle, and you better not mess with his wife. As Em mentioned, I'm now retired, but I was a state trial judge. Some years back, I tried 4 first-degree murder cases, homicide by firearms in 1 year, and I tried 4 cattle theft cases the same year. All 4 of the homicides were acquitted. They figured that it was justifiable. All 4 of the cattle thieves were convicted and got hard time in the penitentiary. But 1,500 miles west of here, and here we have an awful lot in common. We share a great number of things. In Waurika, Oklahoma, just like in the valley here in Virginia, people sell booze, people buy booze, people drink booze, and they get drunk, and they get sick, and they throw up, and they black out, and they pass out, and they come to and say, I'll never do that again. We also, even though far behind you in age as far as organization goes, have something else in common. And that we too have found the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we share with you here in Virginia the common solution of recovery. I have the pleasure of being a charter member of the group in Jefferson County, Oklahoma. You see, until some 23 years ago, we didn't have a group in Jefferson County, Oklahoma, because up until just a year or so before that, Oklahoma was constitutionally bone dry. And the Baptists said, since we don't have liquor, we don't have alcoholics. We don't have drunks. My sponsor, who Nell mentioned this morning, one of the two that took her to her first Al-Anon meeting, had been sober a couple of 3 years, and he took dead aim on me. And we started traveling together some, both before and after sobriety. But when I finally got sober and got into a very unique position in that I got back into the courthouse as a prosecutor in the county, I began taking aim on some of the drunks, and before long I picked up another one that had a charge against him and gave him an option. And there were 3 of us, but we didn't have a group. And we traveled 25, 35, 45, 55, 65, 75 miles. We went somewhere nearly every night to a meeting. And the 3 of us would walk in, and they'd say, well, here comes those gypsies from Warika. And then we had 4. And then we had 5. And incidentally, all 5 had Al-Anons. 5 men and 5 women. We started an old saying back there in Jefferson County then, the family that AA's together stays together. And there were 5 of us, so we got real brave, and we registered with General Service as a group. And Tom said that they had the kitchen table group registered as that. As far as I know, we are the only gypsy group in the United States. Of the 5 that started that, 2 have now died. We picked up the finer points of all the groups we attended and incorporated it in our program. 2 are now deceased, and the other 3 are still sober. I'm the only one that's still real active. I still attend my group 3 days, 3 nights a week. But the others are sober and living meaningful and representative lives of sobriety. I hate to call Salitha my pigeon after what you told me. You see, M used to call his sobriety students pigeons until one day he was walking through the park and I don't know whether this feathered pigeon expressed resentment or what it was, but he said after this crude awakening right in the middle of his forehead that he had never since called a pigeon. He called them sobriety students, but Salitha was a pigeon of mine, if you please. Now, I don't really cater too much for men sponsoring women or women sponsoring men, but with Salitha, it was different. I'm sure that from time to time you may have heard that the University of Oklahoma has a football team. Salitha could have played nose guard on that team. She was a rough old gal. Her old face was weather-beaten and her old voice was raspy, and she was broad and she was strong. She spent a long time out there on the streets. And in sheer desperation, she came to me one time and wanted to know if I could help. And I said, I can introduce you to a bunch of people that can help you help yourself. Well, Salitha had been sober 11 years at this time. I was the chairman of a birthday celebration in my group, and she was celebrating her 11th year of sobriety. Now, Salitha had almost gotten well, because this was the first meeting she had attended since her 10th birthday party. And I came down on her pretty hard. I recommended most highly that when she get up to we give a certificate of sobriety in my group. When she came up to the podium to receive her certificate, that she introduce herself to the newer members and reintroduce herself to the older members. Well, when Salitha got up behind the mic, her whole demeanor changed. You could just see this. And the old rough face kind of smoothed out, and that old raspy voice mellowed. And she didn't appear so obtrusive. And before she sat down, her tears rolling down her cheek. After the meeting, we were sharing some of her cake over a cup of coffee. She said, "Cleve, I want to thank you for insisting that I say something tonight, because it wasn't until I stood up to say thank you that I realized I had almost forgotten what it used to be like." This is one reason I'm so grateful to be here tonight. Because when I stand here and tell you what it used to be like, what I used to be like, and what happened, and how wonderful it is now, I can vividly remember that. And I can realize how perilously close you and I walk along that rocky trail each day that drops off into nothingness. And how easy it would be as we walked along this trail to stump our toe on just a little pebble and fall back down in there again. And I don't know if I could get out again. You see, the boulders don't bother me. I can see the big rocks and the boulders, and I can go over them or around them. But it's these little old loose pebbles that might get us in trouble. And this helps me to remember that I deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, and powerful. And it also reminds me that we deal daily with alcoholism, which is patient, progressive, and terminal. So right now there's no place I can think of on God's earth I'd rather be than right here. And there's no group of people I'd rather be with than you. Without sounding inflated, there's no one I'd rather be than me. It hadn't always been that way. You know, there was a time when I don't care where I was trying to figure out a way to hook them and get out of there. And I don't care who I was with. I was trying to figure out a way to get rid of them and go find somebody that understood me. And I sure wasn't happy with me, because I drank gallons of that liquid detergent trying to change who I was and what I was. But because of my association in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, I've come to believe that as I stand here tonight, good, bad, or indifferent, I'm who I'm supposed to be. And I'm the only Cleve that God will ever make. And somehow, some way in this mosaic of life, I fill the place I'm supposed to fill. Now, I've looked back in retrospect and wondered why I'm an alcoholic. I think we all do. I shouldn't be. I had a very happy life as a child. Mama never put me on the pot backwards. Daddy never took away my little red wagon. Everything I tried to do, it seemed like I did. My mother was a devout Methodist. We were the type of family after supper in the evening, we'd read a few verses of Scripture. My dad was more politically influenced, but he had a lot of wisdom. He used to tell me, son, you can be anything you want to if you're willing to pay the price. No trail's too steep, no dream impossible if you're willing to pay the price. And as a youngster, I paid an awful lot of prices for his attention and approval. I won a lot of gold medals, fine arts, dramatics, track, runner-up in the state Golden Gloves as a bantamweight, Eagle Scout at age 15. All the things that my dad wanted me to be, I was. And it was a good life. And I think about my alcoholism today and all of the things that have occurred in my life. Today I am a member of the Oklahoma Judicial Conference. This is an organization, far from a fellowship, but an organization of state trial judges. I'm now retired from the bench, but I have been appointed by the Supreme Court to senior status. I'm still a member of the Oklahoma Judicial Conference. And we like to consider ourselves to be intelligent, wisdom-filled, respected, highly esteemed jurists. And I hold a unique distinction in that organization. I'm the only judge member that at one time in his past was incarcerated in the county jail in the bailiwick that later elected him to 18 straight years on the bench 13 times. Now, I tell you that for one reason only, is that I wanted to tell you that my beautiful wife, Nell, is also a judge. She is a municipal judge in the city of Warwick, Oklahoma, and the town judge in Ryan, 10 miles south of there. It's kind of one of these have gavel, will travel deals, you know. But I like to tell you that before I tell the joke about the cross-eyed judge. It seems one Monday morning they brought these 3 weekend drunks in front of this old cross-eyed judge. And he looked down at the one on the end and he says, "What's your name, fella?" And the one in the middle said, "Harry Brown." He said, "I didn't ask you." The one on the other end said, "I didn't say nothing." And I never think about that, but what I think about the old Oklahoma rooster that was cross-eyed. Now, this old cross-eyed rooster one morning was chasing 2 hens around the barnyard. And the older one turned to the younger one and said, "We better slow up and run together, or he might miss both of us." December the 7th of 1941, I was playing trumpet solos in a fine arts recital, and word came in Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I was a senior in high school, 17 years of age, and this changed my whole life. I went to the movies too, and I made up my mind I wanted to wear a pair of silver wings and be a captain. And the only way a 17-year-old kid could do that was wait until he was 18 and go into the Air Force and be a pilot. And that's what I did. And when I was 19 years old, I was a second lieutenant pilot flying combat in Italy. I went overseas in medium bombardment, and they transferred me out of the replacement depot into a cloak and dagger outfit. I went to work for the Office of Strategic Services. We flew off of a secret field in Brindisi, Italy, and the outfit was known as the Balkan Air Force because there were Italians flying off the field, and English and Australians, pilots from New Zealand, and Greeks and Americans. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen The Dirty Dozen, or The Dirty Dozen #2 on television, and you've seen these spies and espionage agents that had blown up the bridge or whatever they were supposed to do, and they run down to this old cow pasture, and here comes an airplane out of the dark, out of the night, and lands and picks them up and takes them back. Well, that's the kind of work I did. And it was quite exciting. I don't want to go through the war, but I will tell you that after my first mission, I walked in to debriefing, and there was a table there with bottles of whiskey on it and big glasses. And I'd flown co-pilot that night for Captain Paul E. Davidson, who was killed a couple of weeks later. But I said, "Captain Paul, what's that?" He said, "That's your combat ration. Pour you a glass full and drink it." Well, I didn't know. Some of the boys got so tightened up on those missions, they really didn't want to talk to the intelligence officers, but I drank down my big glass of Gibson's rye whiskey and went into the intelligence officer, and he asked a question, and I answered it. He asked another question, and I answered that one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one before he even asked them. I didn't become unruly, but in the history of my outfit, I was the only pilot officer they ever asked to leave debriefing. Now, we flew at night, mainly in stripped-down B-25s or C-47s, and we flew alone, unarmed and unescorted, the citations used to say. And I got back to the squadron area about breakfast time. And while some of the boys went down to this end of the building that was our bar and mess hall and club to have their Spam and powdered eggs, I went up to the other end and beat on the bar. And before 10 o'clock that morning, when they graciously poured me into my bed, I had some rum and vermouth and gin and vermouth and cognac and vermouth. I became very ill. And I said, I'll never do that again. It was that old Italian gin and cognac that made me sick. Now, we played a game, and I've got to tell you this. If you went 5 missions without drinking your combat ration, you could have a full 5th. Now, that's a little pool game that we made up among the kids, and that's all we were, was a bunch of kids. But seriously, there were enough didn't get back from their 4th and 5th missions to get their 5th. Every time I flew 5, I had a 5th. And it was fine American whiskey A lot of you kids won't know what I'm talking about. But I'll get some chuckles out of the old timers when I mention 3 Feathers or Bella's Reserve. Not even as good as 10 High. But that's what we used to get. And I'd get that 5th and a couple of Cokes, and I'd get my old Army 45 and a couple of boxes of shells and a Jeep, and I'd drive up the Adriatic coastline. And I'd drink some of that fine American whiskey, and I'd quick draw that old 45 and shoot at the sand lizards. And I'd swagger along. For a little while there, I was Hopalong Cassidy, Gene Autry, Wyatt Earp. More than once, we had the shootout at the OK Corral, right there on the Adriatic beach. Then after I got tired of playing cowboy, I'd turn my collar up and become sinister. And I became Dick Tracy, Sam Spade, and I wiped out the underworld. Then I'd run out of ammunition, and I'd walk along the coastline, put a pebble under my tongue like that Greek that had the speech impediment, you know, and deliver dramatic declamations to the pounding surf. And then as the whiskey went down in the bottle and the sun went down in the west and the little Italian sailing vessels, the little fishing fleet would be coming back in, I'd find the highest sand dune I could find and stand up on top of it and sing Red Sails in the Sunset, just like old Bing Crosby used to. I tell you that for one reason, because right there in the middle of terror and fear and death, whiskey made me how I wanted to be, and when I wanted to be, and where I wanted to be, and why I wanted to be, and who I wanted to be. Some of you can't remember, if you're as old as I am, where you were 45 years ago tonight. I can tell you where I was. I was running around the Papuk range of the Dinaric Alps in northern Yugoslavia trying to keep the Germans from catching me. Because on July the 21st of 1944, way up on the Danube River in northern Yugoslavia, a night fighter had downed my airplane. That night we were carrying 5-gallon cans of gasoline, rifle ammunition, and some small hand grenades, and we were going in to land and deliver these to Marshal Tito's partisan forces, the guerrillas. We were letting down in the mountains, and this night fighter, Ju-88, walked up right behind us with his 4 tracer-firing 30 caliber guns right on us. And you know, you talk about remembering how it used to be. Right now as I stand here, the fur on the back of my neck stands up because I can vividly remember the tracers coming through and going in the firewall in front of me. And then he tripped the switches on 4 forward-firing 20-millimeter cannons, flying an old C-47 that night, 800 gallons of 100-octane gasoline in aluminum gas tanks. In 5 seconds, that plane was held in 20%. Gave the order to bail out, and I got up, and all the control surfaces just burned away immediately, it seemed like. And the back end was on fire, and I got up and snapped on a little chest pack. First time I'd ever done that. That's the first time I'd ever bailed out. You know, they used to practice that as a part of the cadet training, and boys were breaking ankles and hurting knees, and they figured, why practice something you had to do right the first time anyway? So I snapped this on, and I was standing there waiting on my best friend, the navigator, to get his chute straps snapped. The plane swapped in with itself. That's all I can say. It went into an inverted spin, I think, and I ended up back in the cargo compartment with the 5-gallon cans of gasoline and exploding rifle ammunition. Now, they say a drowning man, as he goes down the third time, that his whole life passes before his eyes. Maybe so if you're drowning, but you're in the back of an airplane that's on fire and going down. The only thing you think about is, how do I get out of here? And there were a series of explosions, and part of the fuselage was blown away, and there was a gaping hole, and I died through it. I'd put my chute on upside down and backwards. And the tech orders had said that you reached up and grabbed the D-ring, or the ripcord. And when you were sure that you were clear of the aircraft, you pull firmly. Well, I reached for the D-ring and it wasn't there. And I began clawing and what have you, and I finally pulled it with my left hand, and it works. It just all comes off and hits you in the face that way. And I was swinging violently, and I looked around just as the plane plowed into the side of one of these sheer mountains. And I say plowed because it hit the mountain at just the angle of its descent. And just plowed a furrow for, it seemed like it went on forever and ever and ever, spewing burning cargo and gasoline and fire on down into the valley. And I looked up and I swung into a sheer cliff. And I remember putting out my right leg to brace myself and becoming sick as it felt as though it went the wrong way. And I fell on down into a gorge, and I don't know how long I lay there before I came to myself, but there was quite a fire down in the valley, and there was a truck down there, and there were voices that didn't sound friendly to me, and they'd told us, don't get caught. The Geneva Convention does not apply to you because you're working with the underground. They'll make you dig a hole, shoot you, and kick you off in it. And I was scared to death. I knew I was hurt. I couldn't use my right leg. And I was completely alone. And that was the first time in my young life I had ever been completely alone. You know, I always had somebody. My boxing coach, my football coach, my track coach, my scoutmaster, band director, my older sister, the kid next door, always somebody. But there wasn't anybody but me, and I was up there all by myself, and I was hurt. And I wondered why I was still alive. Why was I still alive? I knew nobody else had made it out of that plane. There's just no way. And in my 19-year-old desperation, I cried out inwardly, what am I going to do? And I thank God for my dear Methodist mother. Because when I said this, as I looked at the silhouette of the peaks from the fire down in the valley, I heard the words of the psalmist. I shall lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from God that made heaven and earth. And I said, God, I don't know why I'm still alive. Maybe somewhere, sometime, you got something for me to do, but I can't do it here. And it's a long ways back, and I'm hurt. But I'll do everything within my power to get back, to do what you want me to do, to be what you want me to be, if you'll just help me. And I didn't hurt as bad, and I wasn't afraid anymore. I couldn't walk, but I could scurry. Now that's where you use two hands and one foot and drag one. And somehow that night, a little bit at a time, I made it up over that peak and headed south toward where I knew the Partisans' army was. It was a long ways back to Italy. I got with an old peasant, and I got with his son, and I rode in a wagon of hay just like the movies show. I got with a British commando from the famous Red Horse Brigade that was over there as a liaison officer. I finally got on up into the mountains with Tito's partisans. And I spent some time with them, and it seemed like I walked all over northern Yugoslavia, but I finally was evacuated by my own outfit. And I got back to my outfit, and I was in pretty good health then, but they gave me a chance to come home. They thought probably that I was psycho by then. And to prove that I was, I stayed over. I went ahead and flew until the Germans gave up, and then I changed theaters and was still flying when the Japs gave up. Always feeling like I was cheating. Because you see, God and I became very close in our travels together. You know, we slept in haystacks, and I got lice, and I figured God did too. And by the time we got back to Italy, the lice that we had firstly gotten had lice. And we'd come to those cold mountain streams, and I'd make mention of the Red Sea, you know, parting of the waters. He wouldn't do it, made me wait him. But I'd joke with him. I'd say, hey, like them apples, pretty frosty, isn't it, you know? But we got to be good friends. And Colonel Scott of the Flying Tigers had written a book, God is My Co-Pilot. And you know, I knew what he was talking about. I got back to the University of Oklahoma for the spring semester of 1946, barely old enough to go in the joints and buy a glass of beer, as a captain with an awful lot of ribbons, you know. And I thought I'd missed 3 years of my life. So with Special Dean's permission, I enrolled as a special student. And from January of 1946 until September of 1949, completed the equivalent of 7 years of university and got my law degree. Now, it was my senior year in law school that I became very serious about the little Al-Anon that spoke this morning. I'll tell you, she was the cutest thing in southern Oklahoma and northern Texas, the whole great Midwest. And we got married, and we had a little apartment there on the campus, and it was a great semester. We used to say we tiptoed through the tulips on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. And I graduated, was admitted to the bar, and got an appointment as a government attorney in Tulsa. We moved up there a year. I didn't particularly like the big city life, and we packed up and went back to the shortgrass country in southern Oklahoma. I hung out my shingle and began practicing law. Things just went too good. Shortly after we came back, I got the appointment as county judge, and I was the youngest judge of a court of record in the state of Oklahoma. Didn't pay much, but there's a hell of a lot of prestige. And Oklahoma, as I said, was constitutionally bone dry. It was the county judge that issued the search warrants for the bootleggers. Did you ever see a search warrant? It says, go raid these premises, and if you find illegal intoxicants, seize them and bring them to me. We also had a law that said that illicit intoxicants should either be sold in commercial channels outside the state of Oklahoma or destroyed. Well, the old sheriff, he says, I'll go get a destruction order. So I typed it all up for him. He took it up to the judge, or the DA, took it down to the DA and had DA sign it and brought it back. And I signed it to destroy it. About 2 hours later, he came in and said, I destroyed 12 pints in the floorboard of your car. Always had booze. We had so much booze down there one time, they had a cell. It is a cell full of it, and they had to quit putting drunks next to it and use another cell. Had a cell and a half of whiskey down there. But election was coming up, and the sheriff needed that. He used it to get votes with. But I always had all I wanted. I served 3 terms as judge and then became the DA, prosecutor. And this is about the time in my life that my only excuse for alcoholism is I drank too much, too often, too long. I became an obsessive, compulsive drinker, completely dependent on alcohol. And it was all downhill from then. I got drunk in the courtroom, prosecuting 2 armed robbers, spun on my heel to emphasize a point to the jury, and fell flat on my big fat reputation right there in front of the district judge and the 12-man jury. I put a nice article in the paper. It was time to file for re-election, telling them that I'd given them 10 years of my life and served them honorably and well, and I was going into private practice. Nell says I wisely chose not to seek re-election. But then it snowballed. This is the time that all the bad things began happening to me. I was officing with my father. One morning he walked up to me just all at once and just got right up in my face. And he said, son, are you drinking around my office? And I wasn't feeling good that morning, and I just wasn't too fast on my feet, and before I even thought, I said yes. He says, you're drinking vodka, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. He says, if you're going to drink around my office, drink scotch or bourbon. Something that'll smell. I'd a hell of a lot rather have people know you were drunk than think you were just a damn fool.
This is the end of side 1. Please stop your machine now and turn the tape over for side 2.
Continued to study, and I had received my Juris Doctor degree from the University of Oklahoma. And this was really fuel for my dad. He would introduce me to some of his contemporaries from time to time as this is my son who is educated far beyond his intelligence. And this is when the bad things started happening. I can tell you that one term of court as a defense attorney There were 31 driving under the influence cases on the docket for trial. The other attorneys in that area were representing 17 of the defendants. I was representing 13, and I was number 31. We had an old deputy sheriff named Hoyt. Now, in order to be a deputy sheriff in Jefferson County back then, you had to be over 6 feet tall, weigh 200 pounds, wear high-heel boots, tight-fitting Levi's, a white shirt and a big white hat and a belt buckle that was 8 inches across, and walk with a limp. Now, if you walked with a limp, this meant that you'd been a bull rider and one had thrown you and rolled over on you. But this was the qualification to be a deputy sheriff. Didn't have to read or write, just walk with a limp. One morning, I'm attired in my black Hart-Schaffner marked suit, string tie, white shirt, high-heel black boots, tailor-made. I had them handmade, and in the heel of my boots, instead of wearing rubber caps, I had them cut a V and fit a steel V in there. They clicked. And I wore a Kevin McAndrew brushed beaver little snap-brim black hat. About 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was walking along the sidewalk block from my office, clicking those heels, whistling a song, and this black and white pulls up. And the door swings open, and it's Hoyt, this deputy sheriff. He says, "Get in." I walked over, and I said, "What can I do for you this morning, Mr. Smith? Something bother you?" He says, "Yeah, get in." I said, "I really don't have time. I have some clients waiting in my office." He says, "Get in. You're under arrest." I said, "What for?" He says, "For drunk in public place." I said, "You got to be kidding." He said, "No, get in. You're under arrest." I figured, what the hell? You know, I'll go with him one time, just a couple of blocks up the courthouse. I'll go up there and make bond. And so I went up there with him. Now, I got to tell you, when I drank, I had 2 sizes of clothes. My weight fluctuated a great deal. I had my skinny clothes and my fat clothes. This particular morning, I was skinny, but I was wearing my fat clothes. They took me up to the office and made me take off my boots and give them my belt, plus everything in my pockets. Then I went on up to the 4th floor of the courthouse, which was a jail. I had to hold my breeches up, you know, because if you wear boots, your pants are 1.5 inches longer than they're supposed to be. So and these were the fat ones anyway, so I was holding them up in my stocking feet, you know, and I went up there and they opened up the cell, or the drunk tank. And I said, I don't need to be. About that time, Hoyt gave me a shove. There'd been some drunks in there the night before. They hadn't cleaned the cell yet. I don't know what they'd been drinking, but I can tell you what they'd been eating. And you know, I just kind of skated across that floor. And I said those famous words, "This will never again occur in my life." 2 or 3 weeks later, walking along the same street, about the same time of day, clicking those same heels, you know, and whistling that same song, and same black and white pulled up. It's old Hoyt. And he says, "Get in." I said, "No." "Last time you subjected me to indignities, and by God, I'm not going." Well, he pulled out blackjack. Now, they don't use blackjacks now like they used to, but these were about 16 inches long, and they were heavy leather, and they were flat. One end, there was a handful of buckshot in and stitched around it. If they hit you flat, knock you silly as a dickens. If they hit you sideways, it'd crack your head open, or at least resulting lacerations were the answer. Anyway, he grabbed his blackjack, and he come running around that car, and he says, now you either get in or I'm going to use this. And I said, well, you're just sure as hell going to have to. He just sure as hell did. Well, a couple of weeks later, walking along the same street, clicking those same heels, whistling that same song. Beautiful morning, you know. This black and white pulled up. Hoyt. He says, get in. I said, no. Last time you physically abused me. Well, he just grabbed that blackjack and came bailing out around that car. And I told you I'd been a boxer, gone to the final with the Golden Gloves. Hit pretty good for a little man. And back then, I used to wear a fraternity ring. It's about that big around, and had my fraternity's crest, Delta Upsilon crest, right on it. Now, Hoyt, I think at one time in his life may have taken a few drinks, because his nose was a little larger than most noses. And it was one of those that without even looking too close, you could see veins in you. You've seen those noses. Well, he drew back like he was going to hit me, and just as he did, I unloaded. I hit Hoyt right on the end of the nose with my fraternity crest. And as his head popped back and I drew back, a livid purple Delta Upsilon crest jumped out to stare at me. Then he hit me. I caused Hoyt's nose to bleed. And Hoyt was a bleeder. And the lacerations to my scalp bled. And we were an ornery looking pair when he finally threw me in that drunk tank. But you know, the legislature had enacted a bit of legislation that prohibited assault and battery on a police officer with teeth in it. Then on my later years as judge, I was the only resident judge in my county. And I'd go into the courtroom on Monday morning, and I'd have some drunks, and I'd have some drunk drivers, I'd have some burglars, I'd even have a homicide and sanity hearing, 3 divorces and motions in a civil case, and you name it. But I'd have this poor old Alky, you could tell. You could see the sutures in his head, you know. Weighed about 105 pounds, wringing wet. Couldn't lick his own lips, you know. And he's charged with assault and battery on a police officer. Well, things changed by then. Police officers are pretty sharp back there now. They've all gone to school, and they give you an impression that the state's proud of. They wear a mustache. It's a very trim little mustache. And they wear 1942 haircuts. And they wear uniforms, and these uniforms have the military creases in the back. And probably he's got a 30-inch waist and a 46-inch chest, you know. And this little fellow is charged with assaulting and battering him, and there's not a mark on him, you know. If there was ever such a thing as compassion, I felt it at that time, you know. I developed quite a reputation as judge in my area. I used to ride in the middle of court with the courtroom full, you know, tell the people they didn't have to live that way anymore if they didn't want to. That there was a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous that had answers. And if they were interested, Just have a seat, and I'll see you in chambers after we recess. Had an old boy here not long ago asked me about, is that AAA stuff still going? I says, yeah, old Dugan. Dugan says, well, Judge, I think I'm about ready for that, but not today. Can I come in and talk to you about it? And I said, yeah. Hadn't seen Dugan since then. He's in penitentiary now. But I gave him the opportunity. I became known as the Godfather. You know, I'd give these people an opportunity. I say, now you can either attend Alcoholics Anonymous for 6 months, 2 times a week. Meet me at the meeting. Don't bring me a damn chit. I'll see you there. See me at the meeting for 6 months, or do 6 months in jail. I never did have one choose jail. And they used to call me the Godfather because I made so many offers that people couldn't refuse. But you know, it was that time in my life, as I was in and out of jail, that I saw the sweet young love that Nell had known completely diminish. And I saw fear and lack of understanding, resentment, disgust in her eyes. Now, as she told you, for those that didn't hear Nell, these specialists had told us that we couldn't have children, and we had adopted a little 6-year-old boy, and then we adopted a little 3.5-pound baby girl. And this little old boy just loved me to death at one time. And he absolutely grew to hate me. Didn't want to be around me. And little Rebecca was just a toddler. And I'd come home in the evenings, and if I hadn't been drinking, she would run up and grab me around the leg. And we had a dachshund dog named Sam. And old Sam would just wiggle all over the living room. But you know, if I came in and had been drinking, clear across the room, Rebecca knew it. And her little eyes would drop, and she'd leave the room. And this is a drunken impression, but did you ever watch a dachshund make a 180-degree turn and leave the room? Little old back feet are still coming towards you when these front ones are going out the door. But it was about this time that I learned that Skid Row is not what we grow up believing. I always thought Reno Street in Oklahoma City was Skid Row, or Deep Ellum down in Dallas. I thought Skid Row was a cluttered street in the wrong part of town, you know. Boarded up second-story windows and red lights and always a newspaper or paper sack blowing. The wind always blew on Skid Row. And as you went down that street, there'd be this old boy standing there in the doorway wearing an old GI overcoat, you know, pulled up tight around. It might be the middle of July, but he'd have that old overcoat pulled up. My dad would say he's a Skid Row bum. This is a bad part of town. That was my impression of Skid Row. But see, during this period in my life, I came to know that Skid Row was a personal thing. It is a relative thing. It is a place or a time somewhere in the obsessive compulsive drinker's life where he finds himself where it's constant terror and fear, where it's continual remorse and regret and disgust and despondency and despair. It's a place of busted hearts and broken dreams and tears by the bucketful. And it's a loss of hope. And it's a place of complete aloneness. Not loneliness, but aloneness. Where you exist in a hermetically sealed plexiglass capsule. The love from the outside can't get in, and you're bottled up with yourself. I think back about those days, and the worst part of it all is that I drugged the ones nearest and dearest to me down the back alleys and the dirty byways. Nell insisted I attend AA from time to time. I did. I always had a way if I wanted to go to 35 miles to Wichita Falls, Texas. And you get out of jail and you say, look, hon, that's it. Never do it again. I'm going to go to AA. So you make a couple of meetings. And in a week, it's all cooled off. I fooled the Bar Association. The bar wasn't happy with me. They don't like for fellow lawyers to embarrass the entire Bar Association. Internal Revenue Service was unhappy with me. They've got some silly laws that each April the 15th you're supposed to file some sort of return. And if you miss it a few weeks, they might put a penalty on it. You miss it 3 years and they get damned upset. Things were bad. But I would attend a couple of meetings now and then. Never will forget the first meeting I attended. This old boy stood up and said, you never have to take another drink if you don't want to. First thing you do in the morning when you get up is make an agreement with yourself not to drink that day and ask God to help you. Thank Him that night for a day of sobriety and do your dead level best to live by the 12 suggested steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you never have to drink again, one day at a time, if you don't want to. I thought that was good for those alcoholics. But it didn't apply in my life. And yet, this spring morning in 1965, I woke up so sick I couldn't go on. Vacation Bible School was starting, and Nell took the kids that morning and left me. I'd slept on the couch that night, still dressed in my black suit, still had my boots on. They left me in the house there alone. I remember bouncing down the hallway, going into the bathroom, kneeling in front of the throne, vomiting, upchucking, puking, unswallowing, whatever you want to call it. And then I remember pushing myself up and looking at myself in the mirror and being terrified because I didn't recognize the face looking back at me. Oh, I knew my name and my address, but I didn't know who I was. You see, I'd been so many things, good things, bad things. I'd done so many things, and I didn't know who I was. All I could remember was the night before that I sat on a bar stool and set them up to 25-cent Falstaff beer so that these leeches that hang around in there would let me tell them how extremely brilliant I was. Then I went back in, laid down on the couch, and I can remember this poem coming to mind by Robert Service. It says, when you're lost in the wild and scared as a child, and death looks you bang in the eye, and your sore's a boil, it's according to Hoyle to cock your revolver and die. But the code of man says fight all you can. Self-dissolution is barred. You can whimper and cry. It's damned easy to die. It's a keeping on living. It's hard. And I didn't know how to keep on living. And all at once it dawned on me how extremely frightened I was, how alone I was. Just like that mountain in Yugoslavia. And in my 40-year-old desperation, I cried out those same words. I said, what am I going to do? And you know, I heard the same words again. I shall lift up mine eyes into the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from God that made heaven and earth. And I said, God, I don't know why I'm still alive. Maybe sometime, somewhere you got something for me to do, but I can't do it here, and it's a long ways back. But I'll do everything to get back, do what you want me to do, and be what you want me to be if you'll just help me. And I didn't feel alone anymore, and I wasn't as frightened. I went over to the television set and picked up a 24-hour book that my would-be sponsor had given me 18 months before at Christmas. Made me mad as a dickens for him to imply I had a drinking problem. And I opened it up to that day. I read the thought for the day, the meditation, and the prayer. And I said, okay, Cleve, we won't drink today. God, please help us. And I took a red ballpoint pen and I wrote Thursday 1. And I thanked God that night for a sober day. The next morning I couldn't wait to do it again. I read the thought, the meditation, and the prayer, and I made my little agreement with myself and asked God to help me. And I wrote 2. And that morning, instead of being in intensive care in a treatment center, I went in and showered and shaved and shampooed and shined, put on my black suit, my black boots, my white shirt, my black tie, and my black hat, and I walked to work, whistling all the way. And I thank God that night for a most wonderful day of sobriety. This morning, in the Roanoke Hotel, I got out my little 24-hour book. I read the thought for the day, the meditation for the day, and the prayer for the day. And I took a ballpoint pen, and I wrote 1989, Saturday, 8,844. That's over 24 years, one day at a time. You know, I probably am talking a lot longer than I should, but this is good for me. This, they tell me, is a selfish program. I'm remembering things I haven't thought of in so long. Been sober 3 or 4 years. As Nell told you this morning, she thought she was nicotine withdrawal. And she was pregnant. And there's no fool like an old fool. You know, immediately I knew it would be a boy, and in 1988, my son would win gold medals in the Olympics, the long jump, the middleweight boxing championship, the 100-meter run. That is, if they would let him off over there in England, where he would be a Rhodes Scholar. And of course, Christopher was born. And he had Down syndrome. In the vernacular, that is Mongolism. My son was a Mongoloid. and I couldn't stand it. But you know, God in His wisdom and kindness let me realize that at one time alcoholism was a dirty word. An alcoholic was a word I detested. And yet I had begun to understand alcoholism, and the best people I knew were alcoholics. God changed me and let me accept Christopher for what he was. Several years ago, Christopher carried the torch in the Special Olympics in Oklahoma City. The next year, he won first place in the state in disco dancing in the Special Olympics. And this year, he won 2 gold medals, baseball throw and standing broad jump in the Special Olympics. And he couldn't be more he couldn't care less. And you know, we couldn't be prouder than if he'd brought him back from Korea. Christopher is a wonderful little boy. He is, I think he's what Dr. Bob had in mind when he said, keep it simple. Because he loves for the sheer joy of loving, asking and expecting nothing in return. And as he'll tell you if you ever meet him, I'm Daddy's best buddy. Now, Nell and I have something today that we never dreamed possible. We spend an awful lot of time together, traveling together. We may drive 300 miles to a round robin or a weekend conference, and she sits over on her side of the car and reads, and I drive and play 1942 music on the tape. May not speak for 30 minutes at a time, and yet she's there, I'm over here, and we're together. She's a great Al-Anon. She sometimes suffers from acute Al-Anonism. And the perfect example of her philosophy, I think, a couple of years ago we got a new car. And that's when she was smoking. She's quit again, not for any reason. She just quit. But she smoked then. And we got this new car and started off, and she fired up a cigarette. I said, Nell, I wish you wouldn't smoke in the new car. And she just smiled and said, that's your privilege. I said, I don't like it. She says, you don't have to. I got to be my boy Mike's hunting buddy and fishing buddy, scoutmaster. When he'd been in the Navy for a year or so, he and his high school sweetheart decided to get married. And he wrote me a letter. He says, we're going to have this big church wedding. Would you be my best man? Because you are. And this little old toddler, Rebecca, I got to drive that little doll to school all the time, and just before her 16th birthday, she said, Dad, the kids just can't believe you're not going to get me a new car for my 16th birthday. I said, we'll just have to convince them, hon. You see, every morning I'd drive her to school, pull up in the big circular drive in front of the building, and I would observe the parents in front of me and behind me with their children. Most parents and children are not compatible at 8 o'clock in the morning. And they would be, yeah, yeah. And here's Mama with her hair in rollers and an old chenille robe, you know, and the kid gets out, slams the door, and stomps off into school. Not Rebecca. She never got out of the car. But what she said first, I love you, Dad. Have a good day. That's why I didn't want to get her the car. She got it on her 17th birthday. And then Rebecca got married here 4 years ago, I believe it was, and she asked me if I would perform the ceremony, which tickled me to death. And they reserved the church and had visited with the minister, you know, all the premarital things they do. And she came in and she says, can you marry me? I said, yes, I'm going to. She says, but I want you to walk me down the aisle. I said, honey, it's your wedding. So I had the pleasure of walking my daughter down the aisle, handing her to the groom, then turning around, pulling out my little black book, and performing the ceremony. And now she's given me a grandson that's the apple of my eye. So many great, great things have happened. Christopher has taught me more about life than all the books I've ever read. He was sitting in Elle's lap in the den. He looked up and says, Mama, I love you. Looked over at Rebecca. Said, Becca, I love you. And he looked at me and said, Daddy, I love you. Now, this is a few years ago, and he still couldn't talk real plain. Still can't. But he said, and Philipper, I love you. We laughed about that. And then it dawned on me. You know, that's what this program's all about. Christopher could love us because Christopher loved Christopher. Now, an old, dirty, stinking, stumbling, obnoxious, smelly drunk can walk through that door right over there into this group. And he'll find himself in the middle of the most unique breed of cats that God ever created. Because you have this ability not only to tolerate, but to love a drunk. And you'll put your arm around him. And you'll say, come on, let's get a cup of coffee. It'll get better. One day at a time, there's a chance. You can make it. You're a human being and you're entitled to personhood. And you know he's impressed because you smell clean, you look clean, and you are clean. And this is the first time in a long time that anyone has recognized him as a person. So he stands a little taller in his own eyes' sight. To the extent he stands taller, you too stand taller. And he can recognize you as an individual person and not just a face. And then you continue with your love and affection and the fellowship. And he begins to respect himself, and he begins to respect you. He begins even to like himself, and he likewise likes you. And ultimately he begins to love himself as the child of God that he's supposed to be. And in return, he can love you as a child of God that you're supposed to be. Now, they talk about the merry-go-round of alcoholism. I submit that there's a merry-go-round or a squirrel cage of recovery that's based on the giving and the receiving of love. We took a trip to Florida to visit son Mike and his family. We went down in a van, and Christopher flew co-pilot for me as I drove, and he handled the music. Now, we had a set of tapes that I had purchased from Reader's Digest. Jukebox Saturday Night. And it was all the old 1940 and early 50 music. This was an 8-track, and there was one program on one tape that had Nat King Cole singing the Christmas story, the Christmas song, Tex Williams singing Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette, or was it Hank? One of them. Margaret Whiting singing A Tree in the Meadow, and then Nat King Cole again singing Nature Boy. This was Chris's favorite program on his favorite tape. Mike was stationed in Key West, Florida, and that's about as far that way as you can get. And it took 3 days to drive down there the way we went, so for 3 days I heard the Christmas song, A Tree in the Meadow, Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette, and then it came up to Nature Boy. Now, I'd seen the sheet music to Nature Boy, and it came out, and it had this long, straggly-haired guy with a beard and wearing a goat skin and playing a flute or a lute or whatever. I thought, I'm not good. Nature Boy. Damn hippie's what he was. I just won't listen to it. And all the way to Key West, I just blocked off. When I got to Nature Boy, I just blocked it off. Well, we stayed a week, and then we came home. Took 3 days. I had the Christmas song, Tree in the Meadow, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette, blank. We'd been home about a week, and I had to go up to Duncan, which is 25 miles north of Waurika, to preside in Stevens County. I was driving along the highway, listening to the Christmas song, Tree in the Meadow, Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette. Nothing unusual about this, unless you consider that I was not even in the van. I didn't have the tape deck on in the sedan. There wasn't a tape in it. Nell mentioned something about learning a foreign language in your sleep. Anyway, it came up to Nature Boy. And I thought, I believe I'll just listen to that. To see what there is about it this little boy they call retarded loves so much. Did you ever listen to Nature Boy? Listen to these words. Now this is what Christopher loved so much. There was a boy, a very strange, enchanted boy. They say he wandered very far over land and sea. A little shy and sad of eye, but very wise was he. And then one day, one magic day, he passed my way. And while we spoke of many things, fools and kings, this he said to me, the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. I submit to you that Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other. I further submit that Alcoholics Anonymous is even more than that. Alcoholics Anonymous is a brotherhood of the second chance. where a smelly, pukey, dirty, stumbling, obnoxious drunk like me can walk through a door like that into a room of people like this. And because of the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, learn to love and be loved in return. Thank you.
This tape was produced by Happy Trudge Audio, Roanoke, Virginia. For a list of other tapes available, please write Happy Trudge Audio, Post Office Box 20615, Roanoke, Roanoke, Virginia 24018-0062. Thank you for your purchase, and we hope you have enjoyed your tape.